Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to talk about multiple dimensions. But before I launch into it, I want to remind you of the previous podcast when we talked about a wave-based reality. At the end of that podcast, we gave an experiment on neutron decay. And I want to say that what I say from here on out, the rest of all the podcast episodes, is moot, meaningless, and subjective unless you can do that neutron decay experiment or some other experiment to show that there is a possibility that reality is wave-based and not particle-based or quantum mechanics-based. So everything we talk about in this podcast is going to be subjective, but I wanted to give you an idea and a couple concepts about multiple dimensions so that you can understand them when people talk about multiple dimensions in a wave-based reality. Now, to start off with, let's use an analogy of mobile communications. How do you tell someone how two cell phones can speak to each other or talk to each other if they're 100 miles apart? You can't unless you describe the cell phone towers, the network equipment, the high-speed data networks that connect the two phones together. Or in other words, it's the network infrastructure that supports them. And I believe the same thing is true when it comes to talking about multiple dimensions and non-physical reality. And also when people talk about paranormal abilities or what I call spiritual abilities, it's just like a cell phone. You can't really comprehend those abilities unless you can describe the infrastructure that supports them. And that's what we'll talk about today with multiple dimensions. So the first thing I want to show you is how multiple dimensions can exist in a frequency-based environment. The formula you see on the screen here comes from my book, and this is just a quick shameless plug. You can look for my book on Amazon under Mark Hunter Brooks. The title is Christianity from a Spiritual Perspective. It doesn't really talk about Christianity. It talks about a wave-based network because that was my justification for how Christianity and other world religions can exist without using doctrine or dogma. So it's all about wave-based networks, and that's what I'm going to get into here. So that's where you can find this information and some of the other charts that we'll discuss later on. But the idea here is there's a physics formula that talks about standing wave vibration on a string. And we can use this to explain multiple dimensions. You have, the frequency of a vibration in this formula, but over on the right-hand side, when you talk about harmonic frequencies for standing wave vibrations, underneath the square root is the formula that would give you the concept of multiple dimensions. And it's tension over the linear mass density or mass per unit length of a string. And we can describe this using guitars and guitar strings. But look at each guitar string as a different dimension. And here's an illustration. Again, it's from my book. The very thinnest string on a guitar, and if you have the head of the guitar up here, you can pluck that and it will sound the note of an E. But you can get that same note if you put your finger on a fret for each of the different strings, and you go down through here, you can pluck the same note. But even though those strings are different in terms of their density, you can get the same frequency of a note out of it. And that's the concept I wanted to show you here in this graphical representation of multiple dimensions, all in the same environment, where you have your physical body in the physical dimension, but you also have these other dimensions of what we call they're interpenetrated in the physical. And I'll explain that for you in just a second. But in addition to the physical dimension, you have the etheric dimension, which is a near mirror image of the physical. And that's also in the same dimension with the physical. But then you move to a different dimension, a different string for the astral dimension, the mental dimension, the causal dimension, and then the formless dimension. And as you move up in these dimensions, the density gets less and less. Now you can show that again on another chart. This is again from my book. This chart combines 5 different sources of information about the non-physical environment. And it shows how they're all interrelated and how they all say essentially the same thing. But you can see the physical dimension here in this purple circle, the etheric dimension, the astral dimension, the mental dimension, the causal dimension, and the formless dimension. But what I also wanted to draw your attention to is this little blue box over here on the right-hand side where it says body shed, is that in order for us to move, or for our consciousness to move from one dimension to another, it has to move from a more dense body into a less dense body. And in a wave-based reality, this explains the concept of death. Your consciousness is eternal, it doesn't die. But what you do when you leave the earth, you leave this planet, this physical dimension, your consciousness moves from a more dense body into a less dense body in the etheric, and then in the astral, the mental, and the causal dimensions. So that's an explanation for death that can be gleaned from some of the books that I wanted to show you. And these talk about a non-physical reality and a wave-based reality. Again, we have Schrodinger's universe, which I talked about in the previous podcast. The next book is Occult Chemistry, and don't let the topic or the title scare you. It's really showing you the interface between the physical and the etheric dimensions with atomic matter. And this book was first published in 1910. There's 3 editions of it. The latest edition came out in 1951. But in it, it shows 97 different atomic elements and how they decompose from a physical element into different stages of an etheric environment element. So Schrodinger's universe talks about a wave-based reality. Occult chemistry talks about the interface between the physical and etheric dimensions and how it affects matter and how matter is different in those dimensions. It also makes the point of the interface between the physical dimension and the etheric dimension. Is to make this point here too, is that quantum mechanics, you may say, is the physics of the subatomic. And I would suggest, or propose to you, that it's not that, but it's the physics of the multidimensional. And what you're seeing at the subatomic level, which is different, is you're seeing the etheric components of atomic particles or subatomic particles. So quantum mechanics is the physics of the multidimensional, not the subatomic. And that's how you can relate it to conventional physics as well. So let's move on. We can talk about that later. I hope I get some comments in the episode that we can carry on this conversation. The next 2 books actually talk about the dimensions. They talk about the astral dimension and the mental dimension. And they were written with Annie Besant, wrote Occult Chemistry. But in these 2 books about the astral and the mental dimensions, Charles Ledbetter talks about the characteristics of the dimensions themselves, but also about the beings, the non-physical beings that exist within those dimensions. So that makes for a fascinating and an interesting read, and I'll leave that to you to discover more in there. These next 4 books talk about the non-physical bodies that are attached to our physical body, but in non-physical dimensions. You have the etheric body, the astral body, the mental body, and the causal body. They were written by Arthur Powell in the 1920s and 30s. But what's great about these books is that in the margins of the pages of these 4 books, he gives you other books that he referenced in order to put down the information that he describes in these books. So if you get these 4 books, you're actually getting a gateway to about 40 other books that describe this information in greater detail. So when we go to the next podcast, I want to talk about some other examples of wave-based physics and give you a couple experiments that you can do to help solidify in your mind the whole idea of multiple dimensions and a wave-based reality. And I hope you'll join me for the next podcast of Reality and Revelation. Take care.